I'm Norm Poltenson, the publisher of the Business Journal. I'd like to share with you some thoughts about the campaign debate that's going on and the president's reference to what's referred to as the income gap between the rich and the poor. To frame the debate, what I'd like to do is actually quote the president's remarks, so let me put on my trifocals. In his State of the Union message, and I will abbreviate this for you, the president promised to shrink the income gap between the rich and the poor. We never define rich and poor, by the way. He called it the defining issue of our time. No challenge is more urgent, no debate is more important. And later on, the president continued, he said, we can either settle for a country where a shrinking number of people do really well, while a growing number of Americans barely get by, or we can restore an economy where everybody gets a fair shot, everyone does their fair share, and everyone plays by the same rules. It's clear to me that the debate has already been framed, and the assumption, as the president made them, are that we have in fact a growing gap between rich and poor. This is the fundamental problem in our society today. The answer to it is always redistribution, or what I call the Robin Hood method of taking from the rich and giving to the poor. And it's done on a moral basis that this is fair, this is equitable. There's something about the rich and our capitalist society that the rich inhibit the ability of the poor to move up the income ladder. We saw this with the Occupy Wall Street movement. And there's this concept that the economy is fixed. It's an economic pie. And if the rich gets richer, then the poor must be getting poorer, rather than the concept of the pie expanding. I happen to agree 100% with the president. We need a debate on the subject. But I think we need to look at the assumptions first in what has been framed as this debate. The first assumption is that the metric we used is correct. And that's why I say the president really doesn't talk about how you define rich and poor. Well, the Treasury Department does, the Bureau of the Census, and they take the society and break it up into 5 quintiles. And if I looked at the top 20%, the top quintile against the bottom 20%, and use the metric which is commonly used, which is simply pre-tax income, then those in the top 20% make $15 in earnings for every dollar that those in the lowest 20% earn. What's not included, though, are items like health care, benefits, if you receive earned income tax credits, food stamps, school lunches, public housing benefits. And then, of course, I also said that this is pre-tax income. So if you actually looked at after-tax income, those who are in the supposedly rich category, the top 20%, and paying not only federal taxes but New York State income taxes, can easily pay 30 to 40% of their income, which obviously changes that ratio that I just mentioned. The third factor that jumps out at you when you look at this metric is they measure household incomes. They don't measure personal income. And just one factor, the top 20%, in those households, they have 24% of the population, while the bottom quintile only has 14% of the population. So I would question whether the metric that's used in the definition of that metric is accurate or complete. The second question I would raise is whether the metric is really the best one to use at all. I think consumption would be a fairer unit of measure as to what's really equitable and how the rich and those who are less rich are doing. And by consumption, I mean the measurement of what we actually have in the way of our homes, our cars, our air conditioners, our washers and dryers, the things that we assume is part of our normal life. And if you look at those metrics and the way they have grown, not just for the middle class, but for those we consider poor, if you actually take those in the lowest quintile, or those who are classified as poor, that metric would indicate that those in the American level of poverty live better than the middle class do in industrial nations in Europe. So I think if we looked at consumption, it would be a much fairer indicator of how you measure the relative position of these different quintiles. And then, of course, there's always the question of the moral issue itself, as the president stated it. There's some concept that inequality in and of itself is unfair. There's the concept that poverty is really a result of our capitalist system, and that those who are in the rich category inhibit those who are further down the ladder from mobility and being able to move up the ladder, the economic ladder. And the only way to correct this problem, inherent in what the president has said, is that government has to step in and redistribute wealth. Well, I'd like to reframe the debate on this subject, and I'd like to have an honest debate. And I think we need to go back to what the founders considered to be equality, and what many of us today still think is the definition of equality, which is that there's no one, by virtue of his birth, who can dominate somebody else in society. We don't live in an age of kings. We also think that everybody has to be treated equally under the law, regardless of your stature. Every life in our society has equal value or worth, and the object is to live freely and for each of us to contribute to society. The founders recognized we don't have equal faculties. There are people with different levels, different skills, different intellects. And there's no requirement that everybody have the same material circumstances. Our founders were clear that government, in dealing with the question of a minimum standard, living standard for society, government was clearly the last resort, not the first resort. The first resort would be family, religious organizations, civic organizations, private charities, and government was clearly the last resort if everything else failed. So the current debate, I think, doesn't really let us focus on the real problems of those who are less fortunate. It doesn't address the question of failing schools. It doesn't address the idea in society that we have no more personal responsibility. It's always somebody else's fault and we're all victims. And it also de-emphasizes the importance of a strong family. This focus on redistributing the fruits of those who earn their incomes and giving it to those who are, quote, less fortunate, or the idea in society that the rich inhibit the poor, I think is clearly the wrong focus. I think we do need to reframe the debate. I hope this discussion has helped. Thank you for listening.